All right, Stephen, you got to join with me here. You ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Schlemiel.
Schlimazel. Hasenpfeffer Incorporated.
Any Laverne and Shirley fans? We just
cue the music.
Like there's a whole probably 3 generations that are going, what the hell are they talking about?
What are they doing? Welcome back to the Milwaukee Beer Podcast.
Yeah, there's been a few Milwaukee Beer installments. But you know what? For those who don't know the reference, go to YouTube, Laverne and Shirley, and you'll get it.
Just Google Laverne and Shirley opening song. It's fun. So, and they were 2 roommate young women that worked at a brewery in Milwaukee. Right?
Yeah.
Hilarity ensues. And you and I were in Milwaukee not too long ago, and we walked around and saw the statue of Colonel Pabst, and then we walked over to the Schlitz brewery. We didn't get in. No. They weren't open that day, but so we're talking about Schlitz today, right?
And I'm surprised you said Colonel, given the whole story.
Was it Colonel? Was it Captain?
He was Captain. He was steamship captain. Remember?
Captain Pabst.
Did you forget?
Send the hate mail to Dave at Colonel, Captain. So what rank was Mr. Schlitz?
He was just a Mr. Schlitz.
Just Mr. Okay.
Yeah. The Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, as you mentioned here, is a brewer based out of Milwaukee. And we actually talked a little bit about them in an earlier episode on Pabst, episode 76. We referred to Schlitz. We sort of need to do this podcast to close that part of the story because there was a lot of things that happened between Schlitz and Pabst in the early days. And, Schlitz, in the early 1900s, it became the largest beer producer in the United States, and it held that status on and off through the 1950s. So they're a big deal. They were a big deal. In 1982, ironically, it was sold to Stroh's, and then in 1999, Pabst bought it. So these 2 competitors eventually ended up being under the same umbrella. But in its heyday, big deal. It was the #1 beer in the United States.
Well, and as their advertising slogan said, it's the beer that made Milwaukee famous.
Yeah, there you go.
I want to know what beer made Milwaukee thirsty, because that city was thirsty for beer.
I mean, there's a lot of breweries. A lot of big breweries have come out of Milwaukee. It's quite remarkable. I think it's the German heritage of Milwaukee that makes that happen. Send the hate mail to me. But it started as Krug Brewery and was founded by August Krug in 1894. And when August Krug passed away, the brewery was struggling, and he left it to his widow along with $8,000 in debt. And at this time, the business was being run by his nephew and a bookkeeper, Joseph Schlitz. And they're really trying to keep things together. And at this time, Schlitz is not only working as a bookkeeper, he's also working as the manager, and he offers to help run the brewery. And he actually ends up helping run the brewery, and then he turns the nephew into the bookkeeper. And Schlitz ends up marrying the widow and then changes the company name to Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, and that happens in 1858.
He marries the widow. She has to probably change her name to Schlitz. And why not just change? You're like Krug? Was that
Yes, Krug.
And you think, that's a terrible name for a beer. Let's go with Schlitz.
Because it's so much better.
He marries the company, changes the name.
He marries the company, changes the name, and the goal is now to become the largest in the area. He wants us to become the largest brewer in the area, but they're still heavily in debt, and he needs to get rid of the debt and grow. And he wants to sell outside of Milwaukee. And if you remember from the Pabst episode, there were 35 brewers in Milwaukee, and Pabst had just bought Southside Brewer to become the biggest in the area. So Pabst had just done this acquisition to become the biggest in the area, and Schlitz here is going, well, no, I want to become the biggest in the area. So Joseph Schlitz needs to find an opportunity to sell their beer. And it's 1860, and war is looming.
Civil War, yeah.
Correct, yes. And there's Union soldiers building on the border, and soldiers need beer, so he decides to sell beer to these soldiers because the Mississippi River is not that far away. So he sails the beer down the Mississippi River on barges with ice to sell it to the Union soldiers. He ramps up production tenfold doing this. And by 1865, Schlitz is selling 4,400 barrels of beer and is on the way to become number one as long as the war continues. But we know the Civil War is about to end. And once this happens, sales grind to a halt. So once again, he needs to find a new market outside of Milwaukee. Another opportunity presents itself.
Stay tuned. We're going to wrap up this story and tell you how to apply this lesson to your business right after this.
Hey, Rick, how's it going?
Okay, fine.
That doesn't sound okay.
Well,
What is it?
my business.
What about it?
You probably wouldn't understand.
Hit me.
Well, you know I love it.
But...
My revenues have flatlined and I'm not growing anymore.
Okay.
Well, it's frustrating and depressing, and it was so much better when we were growing.
Oh, I bet it was.
And nothing I've tried has moved the needle.
What about talking to Steven?
Steven who?
You know, the guy that hosts this podcast.
Really? You think he could help?
I hear he runs a paid-for-performance marketing agency.
I wonder how that works.
Why don't you ask him?
How?
Book one of those free starter sessions on the podcast website.
I don't know.
You can't say you've tried everything if you don't try this.
You're right. I might even learn something.
I bet you do.
Thanks, man. Let's go grab a bite.
Yeah, sounds good. Right after you call Steven.
Okay.
Book your starter session on this podcast's website. Just visit theempirebuilderspodcast.com and click on Get Started.
Let's pick up our story where we left off, and trust me, you haven't missed a thing.
So once again, he needs to find a new market outside of Milwaukee. Another opportunity presents itself. October 8th, 1871, we talked about this in Pabst, the Chicago fire happens.
Oh, yeah.
This levels over 17,000 buildings, including 19 breweries. And remember, in this day, beer is also a substitute for water for a lot of people. So it's super important. But Joseph Schlitz is a little bit slow to act on this opportunity. Captain Pabst beats him to it, gets there first. But Joseph doesn't want to be outdone. So what he decides to do is sends rail cars full of water and beer to give away for free to the needy. Give first away for free, people develop a taste for it, then they bought his beer.
And they remembered that he gave him some water and some beer.
And this is when he created the tagline, because he got a lot of press around this, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. And they become the number one beer in Chicago, because they fill this hole lost by the Chicago breweries. So while he was later than Pabst getting to the game, he outmaneuvered Pabst with this whole idea of giving away beer and water for free, developing that taste and that brand loyalty. And as we know from both the Pabst episode and the Budweiser episode, around this time, shelf life for beer is a really big deal. Trying to figure out how to extend the shelf life. So Joseph decides to go to Europe to find a barley substitute as a way to extend the shelf life. So if we remember from Pabst, what they did is they figured out how to use corn and created American lager. Budweiser created bottling and pasteurization. What Schlitz wanted to do was find a barley substitute, and he decided to go to Europe to do it. So in 1875, he heads off to England. His ship crashes on Land's End, the boat sinks, and he dies along with 335 other people.
You're not going to tell me what he found instead of barley, because he didn't.
He didn't. So now the brewery, remember we talked about the nephew, August Eli, that's him. Now the brewery is in his hands. He gets everyone together to develop their own long-lasting lager. Now, his brother had just come back from Copenhagen with this batch of yeast. And so they create this beer called Schlitz Bohemian. You're probably going, never heard of it.
No.
Yeah, didn't sell well. At this time, this new idea, Schlitz Bohemian, doesn't sell well. Pabst is outselling them by like crazy. But when his brother was in Copenhagen, he discovered this idea of tied houses. Now, tied houses became illegal in 1933. But basically, here's when you get this independent operator who is contracted with only one brewer. Basically, they started buying saloons or making deals with saloons where they would only sell their beer. This creates a monopoly, giving all these deals to tie to them, going and buying all sorts of saloons and only selling their product. This creates a monopoly that does get outlawed in 1933, but not before Schlitz finally passes Pabst in 1902. And then, Pabst passes them, and then they get passed by Bud, goes back and forth. And in 1982, it's sold to Stroh's for $500 million, which is now owned by Pabst, ironically. So there's all of this that's tied together. But what I found interesting with Schlitz, to me, there was a couple of lessons. One was he saw this opportunity with the war, which was interesting, saying, okay, I can take advantage of that.
Bring beer down the river and sell it to the soldiers that are there. Sure.
Yeah, he was constantly thinking outside of his area. Even when he was late to the game, what the opportunity happened in Chicago, he didn't let that defeat him. He actually figured out a way to outmaneuver Pabst with this whole idea of let's actually give away a sample. Like, if you really think about it, it's like sampling.
Absolutely.
Sample of the beer, right? They develop a taste for my beer. They then buy my beer. And while I don't like the idea of monopolies or the creation of monopolies, it's still this whole went somewhere else, went to Copenhagen. Yeah. Now, it was to find a different brewing method, but while in Copenhagen, saw here's how the saloons operate in Copenhagen. They're tied to a brewer. Wow, isn't that really interesting? We should do that here. And again, it would have been very easy to dismiss that, because it's often easy to dismiss the things that we see somewhere else, saying, oh, that won't work here. So they were always open, very open to the opportunities outside of their space. And I admire them for that, keeping their eye open for these opportunities and whatnot in terms of how to grow.
That's amazing. It's the first I'd heard of, you called it flag houses?
Tied houses.
Tied houses, not flag. Well, what I find interesting about that made me think is he said they were outlawed, but Coke and Pepsi do that today, right? They'll go into a restaurant and they'll want to be the exclusive soft drink. I don't know how that works.
Pepsi actually followed the Stroh's playbook because they bought a lot of the fast food chains.
Yeah.
They bought a lot of the fast food chains, and those fast food chains can only sell Pepsi.
Yeah.
I don't know the legalities of this enough to sit there and say, hey, why does it work for the soft drink companies? It got outlawed in the beer industry. But, let's face it, Coke and Pepsi learned this trick from somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to think that it's probably a regulation that was put in place in the alcohol industry that just didn't affect everything else. As we know, they regulate alcoholic beverages in a way different way than they do just about everything else.
Yeah.
So interesting.
So there's a few lessons here that we can learn from. One was, the power of product sampling. Like, he used product sampling very well to beat Pabst in Chicago, even though they were not the first to the market. Also, the importance of distribution. When you have a product that goes on shelves, and what they saw is the importance of distribution was tying up these saloons, but they understood that distribution was a real key to this business.
Great story.
Yeah, and we had to cover it because, it helps us now close the Pabst, Budweiser, Schlitz, because they all were sort of doing things at the same time.
So what's next on the Milwaukee Beer podcast?
I'm going to have to dig a little bit for that. Budweiser was St. Louis. So, we did step a little bit outside.
Yeah. For those of you that are following the Laverne and Shirley thread, it was a spinoff from Happy Days. So, dig into that too while you're at it. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please share us, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and leave us a big, fat, juicy 5-star rating and review. And if you have any questions about this or any other podcast episode, email to questions@theempirebuilderspodcast.com.